It's summertime, but Donald Trump's political and legal problems are snowballing. Today, a federal appeals court halting above-ground construction on Trump's prized ballroom. The judge ruling, quote, each president is a temporary tenant, not the owner of the White House and its executive residence. The president has no, and claims no, constitutionally assigned authority over that property. Not mincing words there. Trump saying he plans to appeal to the Supreme Court. But critics, including many Republicans, question why he's focusing on vanity projects at all, given the ongoing war and affordability crisis and the looming midterms. The New York Times' Maggie Haberman, who's been covering Trump for years, said this week, quote, if you looked at a chart of Trump's mind share, 70% of it would be on his renovations. Trump insider telling Axios, quote, Trump concentrates on the hobbies that distract from his terrible polling numbers, about which he is in denial. Here are the facts. Trump's approval rating is now at the lowest of his second term. His disapproval also at its highest, according to prominent pollster Nate Silver. Today, despite these facts, Trump claimed that voters are angry at Republicans, but just not him.
And I've had some great polls recently, real polls, but they're great polls. If I don't run, will those people go out and vote? And that's the one thing I can't tell, because a lot of them are very angry at Republicans, to be honest with you. They're
Why is
angry
that?
I don't know. I mean, they're angry at Republicans, but they're not angry at me.
Thing. Why?
They're not angry at me, but they are angry at Republicans.
The data suggests that both Trump and D.C. Republicans are in trouble. 4 separate polls show Democrats leading Republicans on the generic midterm ballot. Reuters has Democrats ahead by 5 points. CNN, 8 points. Emerson College, 11 points. And The Economist, 4 points. As Axios puts it, for Republicans, this is the Trump-induced summer of discontent. Joining me now is Juanita Tolliver, MS Now political analyst, award-winning author of A More Perfect Party, and host of the Archival podcast. And back with me is Jason Johnson. Juanita, thanks for joining us at the table. Let's start with you. I mean, I want to get your take on these 2 major undertakings by Trump and things that have, whether or not that was his initial intention, some of his major priorities, the war and the ballroom, both of which are now stalled by forces that most people could have predicted. And in fact, some of his advisors did predict to him before the fact. But he has had the same response to both, which is essentially to lay blame on the messenger or to his own party, but not himself. What do you think voters' take away from this quandary should be?
The same lack of focus on their needs that they've been feeling in their wallets, that the same voters who you highlighted in the previous segment informed the world that they feel stuck, they feel trapped. And Donald Trump is yet again putting his attention on things that have nothing to do with them or make their lives more stressful, more expensive, more harmful for them to experience. I also think about that phrase you included from the judgment, temporary tenant, something we all know. Donald Trump might not know it. Yeah. He clearly, every time he puts on a 2028 hat, rejects that reality. But the delusion is reaching a point where even courts are interjecting not only reality, but also separation of powers by emphasizing that Congress has the rights for approval and appropriations for changes to the White House, not Trump. And so when you talk about these issues in Trump's focus, he's now going to give Republicans in Congress who are fighting for their lives in these midterms yet another drag on them to try to explain at home if they decide to move forward with trying to give him funding for this ballroom.
The thing I also keep thinking about, especially this week on the Tales of Michigan, is that a lot of voters are still not even paying attention. And these are the numbers that we're seeing. I did talk to a senior Trump campaign strategist this week who made the argument that Republicans also haven't started spending as much as they're planning on, especially.
But what are they going to say when they start spending?
In Michigan, in Texas, that's a very good question. But do you buy that argument, Jason?
No, that's not going to make a difference. First off, like you said, most people aren't paying attention until Labor Day, right? They're paying attention when football season starts and they start paying attention to the ads. Right. And by then, your feelings about the economy are already baked in. Your feelings about the war are already baked in. None of that stuff is going to magically change. And it doesn't make it any easier. There is some accidental truth, which Trump occasionally stumbles upon, right? People don't like how he's doing his job, but Republicans still, by and large, like him, right? The Republicans actually like him. They just don't like anybody else. And it's this classic situation where, Trump gets the sniffles and the Republicans in general get pneumonia, right? And he can stand up there and do the shaggy defense. It wasn't me, for any other thing that he wants to talk about, right? And they're the ones who have to face the voters. He doesn't. So his sort of protection from his own bad behavior and his own bad policies allow him to say things like that, even if the consequences are going to be felt in other places.
What about, though, the one of the counters that I got that also goes along the lines of the flaws with some of these Republican candidates are already baked in, too, such as Ken Paxton.
Right. But here's the thing. Ken Paxton is running in Texas, and he's running against James Talarico, who has had the opposite effect. And I've said this before, the opposite of what you have in Michigan. They're still kind of arguing, and there's still bad feelings about that primary down there. There's lots of different Republicans in different states that have flaws, that have people who have issues with them one way or another. But if we're talking about a red state, as opposed to, say, what's happening in Michigan, as opposed to what might be up in the air in South Carolina, there are lots of different local factors that are going to come into play that at the end of the day, Trump is not going to have an effect on, and it'll matter if Democrats can rally themselves in those individual states.
And Juanita, I want to ask you about some of the news that broke today, which is the president deciding to restart his battle to fire the sitting Fed Governor Lisa Cook. This has been an ongoing saga, as you know. He, it's a Sisyphean task to try to get in his head and understand where this is coming from. But
I wouldn't dare.
And he signaled as much that as soon as the Supreme Court made their decision to allow her to stay in her seat, that he was going to challenge this again. He said it on Truth Social, I believe, at the time. But I'm wondering, he was potentially looking at the headlines today, if this was just another thing that he decided to sort of throw into the swirl to try to distract his own voters,
sure,
and also maybe to try to manipulate what the Fed is going to do in September when they have the opportunity yet again to try to lower interest rates, which is what the president wants, despite lots of opposition that he's getting from other sitting board members on the Fed.
I think, there might be a level there to what you're saying about distraction tactic. But I, don't think Donald Trump is that smart. I do think he gets fixated the same way he got fixated with birthright citizenship and has now put forth 2 new executive orders. I don't think this is going to mean anything to regular people who are turning out to vote, though. I do think that this is something that is, as Jason mentioned, people already know how they feel when they sit down to pay their bills on the first of the month every month. People already know how they feel when they're standing at those gas pumps. And while Donald Trump is trying to say this has nothing to do with me, what does have to do with him is any Republican voters who stay at home, who drive down enthusiasm, who are not going to turn out for anyone on the ballot, even if he shows up and endorses candidates.
And let's call a thing a thing.
Yeah.
Donald Trump has been particularly hostile towards black women in positions of power.
Right.
That's just a fact. Whether you're talking about Tish James, you're talking about Kamala Harris, you're talking about Lisa Cook, you're talking about 350,000 African-American women who lost their jobs under DOGE.
Right.
This is a particular thing that his administration, whether it's him or Stephen Miller or Pete Hegseth, have focused on. So I'm not surprised by this at all. There doesn't have to be a strategy behind it, but there is a pattern of behavior that we've seen with this particular president and particularly black women in positions of power.
And his fixation on black women.
Yes.
Perfectly said, Jason. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.